Tonight, growing outrage around the world over the death of Alexei Navalny. Hundreds arrested in Russia as memorials expand.
He himself had predicted that this was possibly how his life would end.
And mounting questions surrounding the opposition leader's death. Global protests pack Canadian streets.
We demand for a permanent and immediate ceasefire,
with an offensive pushing forward on the ground in Gaza. Plus, leveling up the fight to bring grocery prices down.
In some ways, they have the most to lose.
The holdouts on a new code of conduct and the push to make it law.
CTV National News with Heather Butts.
Good evening. The death of Alexei Navalny has sparked outrage among his supporters in Russia and around the world. The staunch Putin critic, who Russian authorities say died suddenly Friday. Supporters across Russia took part in vigils in memory of Navalny, with police swooping in and dragging people away. More than 400 people have been detained across 30 Russian cities, according to human rights organizations there. CTV's Rahim Ladani has more on the worldwide condemnation and widespread demonstrations.
After learning her son had died Saturday of sudden death syndrome while taking a walk inside a penal colony near the Arctic Circle, Alexei Navalny's mother was turned away at the morgue, told his body was not there. A spokesperson for the Russian opposition leader saying they were told his body would not be handed to relatives until an investigation into his death is complete.
The reaction was shock but not surprise. There was so much about this that was inevitable. In fact, he himself had predicted that this was possibly how his life would end.
Navalny's death comes just a day after he was seen during a court appearance. He had been jailed since 2021, serving multiple prison sentences for fraud and extremism since he returned to Russia after recovering from nerve agent poisoning, which he blamed on the Kremlin.
He believed in freedom of speech. He wanted his country to be a democratic country.
With less than a month before Russia's next presidential election, the death of Vladimir Putin's greatest political foe will give him another 6 years in power, drawing condemnation from world leaders.
Putin is responsible. What has happened to Navalny is yet more proof of Putin's brutality.
He is a thug who maintains power through corruption and violence.
we are Navalny.
In Toronto, people gathered in Navalny's memory. In Argentina, the 47-year-old's death sparked protests.
Despite the fact he's been through a nightmare, he was always optimistic.
While in the Red Square in Moscow, people laid flowers outside St. Basil's Cathedral. But those tributes coming at a cost, with at least 400 people reported being detained across the country. Navalny's wife, Yulia, is also speaking out against President Putin and his allies, saying they will bear responsibility for what they have done to her husband, her family, and their country. Heather.
Rahim, thank you for this. Joining us now is Elliot Tepper, International Relations Professor at Carleton University. Elliot, how could Navalny's death change the way other world leaders are dealing with Putin? Are we going to see any new tactics?
What we're seeing, I think, is possibly a crystallizing moment. We have seen actually a pattern which has been known but not mainly brought into focus, from Boris Nemtsov being assassinated right outside the Kremlin wall, Kara-Murza, his protege and successor, twice poisoned, and now, like Navalny, being slowly poisoned in jail. And now, of course, we have the death of Navalny. There's been journalists and poets and others and oligarchs. So I think we have a pattern, and if this is seen as a crystallizing moment, basically a dictator killing a hero, there could well be a change of tactics.
All right, Elliot, and how could Navalny's death then impact the war in Ukraine going forward?
Yes, this took place during the Munich Security Conference. He's there right now. He was there trying to tell everybody, please pay attention to us. Now I think everybody's going to pay attention to Ukraine. What they've been saying all along is absolutely true. They are doing this fighting for us. They are confronting Russia, and it would be a disaster if the West stopped supporting Ukraine. This may well give momentum to reignite support for Ukraine as we have this crystallizing moment.
All right, Elliot Tepper, thank you for joining us tonight. And in Ukraine today, 4 people, including a child, were killed in shelling near Donetsk. Ukrainian troops also withdrew from the eastern city of Avdiivka to avoid being surrounded by Russian forces, which later took full control of the city. This comes as Ukraine is desperate for more U.S. aid being held up by Congress. In the Middle East this weekend, signs that talks for a ceasefire are stalling. That grim assessment as the death toll mounts in Gaza, and Israel signals it's pushing on with its next offensive. Here's CTV's Jeremy Charon.
Intensifying airstrikes and an anticipated ground invasion in Rafah. Displaced Palestinians now packing their belongings and fleeing back north. The situation is catastrophic, this man says. We don't know where we're heading. We're searching to see where people are going. The United Nations says more than half of Gaza's population is living here, most of them displaced from other parts of the enclave.
Now more than 1.5 million of people in Rafah, and with the fear of extension of military offensive into Rafah, we can't even imagine what consequences that would have.
Israel says it is thoroughly planning its promised ground invasion of Rafah, despite renewed calls from Washington and the UN to ensure the safety of civilians.
Where do people go in a completely, largely destroyed Gaza Strip, where there's really no safe space for people to shelter anymore?
Strikes in central Gaza today killed more than 40 people and injured dozens, according to Palestinian health officials. Israel says it hit a series of Hamas targets. As today, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said truce talks are pointless unless Hamas changes what he called its delusional demands, while a key mediator from Qatar saying today talks on a potential ceasefire are not progressing as expected.
How do you go about it?
At this security conference in Munich, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke about a future between Israelis and Palestinians.
I think there's an extraordinary opportunity before Israel in the months ahead to actually, once and for all, end that cycle. Virtually every Arab country now genuinely wants to integrate Israel into the region.
Now, Blinken also highlighted what he called the urgent need to move forward with a Palestinian state, which he says, Heather, will also ensure the security of Israel.
Thanks, Jeremy. Here at home, pro-Palestinian demonstrators marched through the streets of Toronto as part of a day of global action calling for a ceasefire. CTV's Sean Lathong was there.
Marching in Toronto as part of a global protest against the war in Gaza.
The fact that people have been taking to the streets in these numbers for this long is incredibly encouraging.
More than 20 cities around the world taking part 4 months into the Israel-Hamas war.
For 133 days and for over 40 protests, our demands have been loud and clear.
As the group gathered in front of Union Station, organizers said police threatened protesters with financial penalties.
The Toronto police has informed us that if anybody gets on the truck while the truck is moving, they will fine us $10,000. Save our TPS!
We asked Toronto police about the potential fines. In a statement, they said police spoke to protest organizers and cautioned them against driving the truck with people sitting in the trailer or hanging off the sides for safety reasons. Organizers agreed to this. We didn't mention anything about a $10,000 fine. Today is the first major gathering since pro-Palestine protesters marched along University Avenue last week, with some climbing the hospital facade outside Mount Sinai, leading to accusations that the protesters targeted the hospital.
This route was one that we have taken many times over the last 5 months, and I think that the categorization of an attempt to say that we targeted that hospital is untrue, and is an attempt to distract from what's happening in Gaza right now.
Organizers say the video of a man climbing the scaffolding was someone who took it upon himself, and it was not planned. Protesters say that they regularly liaise with police and made their route well known beforehand. So while this protest was one of many around the globe today, there have been more than 40 protests in this city since the war began, and protesters say they will continue here until their demands have been met. Heather.
Sean Leithong for us in Toronto. Protesters burned and cut Indian flags outside the consulate in Vancouver to mark 8 months since a prominent Sikh separatist leader was murdered in Surrey, BC. Demonstrators denounced what they describe as a repressive regime. Relations between India and Canada have been strained since the Prime Minister accused India of being linked to the fatal shooting of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. The Indian government has repeatedly denied involvement. 2 years after the convoy protest that brought part of Ottawa to a standstill, another rally on Parliament Hill today, taking aim at the Trudeau government. The scene this time much different than 2022, but many of the messages similar. Here's CTV's Caitlin Wilson.
Wrapped in flags and holding signs, hundreds returning to Parliament Hill 2 years after being forcibly removed by police.
What has been happening the last 2 years is disgraceful, and our government and Trudeau should be ashamed.
Protesting what they describe as government overreach, calling for a change in leadership. And unlike the honking and gridlock of the past, it's a different atmosphere this year, as many say there's reason for optimism.
It's quite rewarding to be here today, actually. We are recognized now that we weren't as wrong as everybody thought we were. I'm not saying that everything is played out the way that we thought, but things are changing quite rapidly.
A recent federal court decision found the use of the Emergencies Act to clear protesters was unreasonable and infringed on their charter rights. Although a public inquiry arrived at a different conclusion, that the government was justified.
To be here and to be remembering, but also celebrating and moving forward with maybe hopefully some accountability coming would be really good.
On Saturday, there was a noticeable police presence with minor road closures as protesters marched through downtown. And bylaw officers were on hand issuing tickets at their discretion.
2 years ago, we almost got arrested, and now we're back because they can't stop us now.
Armed with a long list of grievances, protesters demanding change and accountability.
I can't afford a home in this country because I make minimum wage and I worked in retail for several years, and I still have a hard time even being able to move out of my parents' house.
But not everyone was happy to welcome the so-called freedom movement back.
And everybody's got the freedom of expression, but give me a break. There's a lot more serious issues in this country than what they prescribe.
Caitlin Wilson, CTV News.
The high cost of food has been another sore spot for Canadians this year. Some members of Parliament are turning up the pressure on two big grocers to sign on to a new code of conduct in an effort to stabilize prices. CTV's Sija Liu is looking into the story. Sija, what's the message to those companies?
Heather, a code of conduct which aims to set new rules for fair dealing between grocers and suppliers is supposed to be voluntary, but a committee of MPs studying food prices says if two big grocers who have been holding out, Walmart and Loblaw, don't sign on, they will push to make it law. The committee sent both companies letters yesterday urging them to come on board. Loblaw and Walmart have repeatedly pushed back, saying the code, as it's now drafted, could actually raise food prices. Proponents say it will do the opposite by giving suppliers and smaller grocers stronger voices, helping to stabilize prices.
What the code will do is provide more stability and fairness in the industry, both for independent grocers in terms of they're getting fair supply in rural and remote communities, but also in just more fairness in how retailers and suppliers negotiate with each other.
When you have larger volumes, you're able to negotiate lower prices. And if you negotiate lower prices, which is, of course, a source to your profitability, which probably explains why Walmart and Loblaw are so reluctant to sign on, because in some ways they have the most to lose.
Officials with both Walmart and Loblaw have said their goals are for a code that is in the best interest of consumers. Metro has said that it's willing to sign on, but that the code won't be effective unless all big grocers are on board. The House committee hasn't indicated if there's a deadline for Loblaw or Walmart, but Heather, the plan is to have the code rolled out in the coming months.
All right, Sija, thank you. Coming up, a deadly gas explosion in the U.S.
Total devastation. There's a debris field
well into the street.
What officials found underground at a Virginia home, plus declassified documents linked to a suspected spy balloon. There's new insight into the moments when a suspected Chinese spy balloon was spotted over Western Canada last winter before the story went viral. CTV's Renee Rogers joins us with more. Renee, what are we learning?
Heather, recently declassified documents from the Royal Canadian Air Force reveal that 2 Air Canada flights headed east out of Vancouver spotted a suspected spy balloon days before it became a major news story. The documents are heavily redacted, but they refer to the balloon as a track of interest and later as Object Charlie. And they indicate that Air Canada flights reported the sightings half an hour apart while they were flying over southeastern BC. The suspected Chinese surveillance balloon was first spotted near Alaska on January 28th of last year. It was shot down by the U.S. Air Force on February 4th off the coast of South Carolina. CTVnews.ca received the documents from private investigator Ryan Stacey, who obtained them through an access to information request and has reached out to the Department of National Defense to try to confirm their authenticity. The documents also reveal much more about how Air Force technicians on the ground responded to the sightings. You can read more on our website, ctvnews.ca. Heather.
Thanks, Renee. Donald Trump is back on the campaign trail tonight after a crushing legal blow in his civil fraud case.
This is merely an election interference ploy by a crazed lunatic attorney general.
A New York judge ruled Trump duped banks into thinking his properties were worth much more than they were. He's been handed a $355 million fine and a 3-year ban on running a business in that state. A catastrophic explosion leveled a home in Virginia, leaving a firefighter dead and at least 9 others injured. A horrific scene with smoldering rubble is all that's left. Firefighters were called to the home to investigate the smell of gas. They discovered a 500-gallon underground propane tank with a leak soon after the house exploded, trapping firefighters inside.
Total devastation. There's a debris field well into the street and into the neighboring homes.
A full investigation is underway. Still ahead, Indigenous fashion and newfound fame. An Inuit designer showcases her style on the world stage in New York. An Inuit designer is now fielding a lot of calls after appearing at one of the biggest fashion events in the world. Labrador designer April Allen put some very personal designs in the spotlight at New York Fashion Week. Here's CTV's Garrett Berry in tonight's Indigenous Circle.
With family by her side, April Allen wowed during New York's Fashion Week.
One of the ladies that was at the show came up to me afterwards and, she just said that she loved my show. It felt very powerful and she felt something spiritual about it.
Her Indigenous-inspired designs include traditional materials from Labrador, sealskin, fox fur.
It's about the past, the present, and the future. So I got to bring, down with me a pair of boots that my grandmother made, and I had those on the runway.
She presented on Runway 7, a company that features up-and-coming artists. The show was dedicated to Canadian designs, and she brought some models from her home, Nunatsiavut, with her.
Her sealskin designs are beautiful, but they're also bringing education to people on what sealskin actually is and about the seals and how we use it in our culture.
One of the models was her daughter, Julia Allen.
I definitely thought my mom would get there at some point, but just to be there with her and experience this life event together was, I think, really meaningful.
Allen's been designing for about 4 years, ever since she returned to Labrador from a career in Manitoba. Everywhere she goes, she brings a little bit of home.
It's not just about representing myself, but representing, our ancestors, and they didn't get to do this.
her work has made an impression. Allen is now fielding invites from runways in Paris and LA. She says she'll do her best to keep up with all this new interest, keeping her focus on her heritage and presenting it on the global stage. Garrett Berry, CTV News, St. John's.
After the break, overcoming adversity. A BC athlete finds new ways to stay involved in sports. Finally for us tonight, overcoming the unexpected. CTV's Adam Sawatsky introduces us to a BC man whose athletic career was derailed by a rare condition that was until he found a way to keep competing.
Ever since he was a kid, James Konecki's loved athletics.
It's just hardwired in my body. I don't think I could just go a few days without moving my body.
During school, he played every sport he could, and after graduating, found a job to support his pastime.
Make some money, and then I could do my fitness and sports on the side.
His life couldn't have been better, James says, until his vision suddenly got unexpectedly worse.
And then when they sent me to the ER, that was a bit of a curveball.
The then 21-year-old was diagnosed with a rare eye disease, and just 6 months after one eye was sort of getting fuzzy, James was almost completely blind in both eyes.
It was terrible. I had no idea what I was going to do.
Everything James used to do, which defined him, fueled him, and provided community, he now couldn't do. But then, James heard about blind baseball.
It was awesome. It was so much fun. Kind of propelled me into getting into other sports.
It inspired James to go to university and join the varsity rowing team.
It was tough. It was hard. I spent a lot more time in the water than I was in the boat.
But James persevered and did so well. He started training with the National Paralympic team.
The momentum, sparked more motivation.
It gave James the confidence to look for a sport that would provide some of the autonomy he'd lost, which he found in running.
I can just go run. Nothing's gonna stop me.
After finding routes that were safe and usually wearing a vest that says blind runner, James runs by himself almost daily. He's also completed more than a few marathons.
Just like you're on top of the world.
Although nothing compares to the feeling of proposing to your partner and them saying yes.
It does get better. It does get easier.
And although life does take unexpected turns, James says if you can commit to forge your own path, you'll find you couldn't be happier with the direction you're headed.
Once you can achieve that, you can achieve anything.
Adam Sawatsky, CTV News, Victoria.
Commit to forging your own path. That's great advice. That's our show for this Saturday night. I'm Heather Butts. For all of us at CTV National News, thank you for watching. Good night, and I'll see you again tomorrow.